you've recognized, I think, the what's at the heart of all great horror fiction, which is finding something people love and is comforting and then ruining it forever. So they never feel safe around it again.
Right. Our work here is done. That's right.
The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
I'm really excited to be talking to both you guys. I've been reading you forever, and we have two such different horror novels to discuss here, each dealing with a fantastic dark element entering and transforming an everyday world. Both King Sorrow and Whistle also suggest that there's also a deep abnormality lurking in gentle settings. I'd like you guys to introduce your books to us, though. So start with Linwood.
Well, as it was mentioned, Whistle is my first horror novel, and I'd had this idea sort of percolating for a long time, but it kind of, first a confession, which is that I'm a model train nerd, and have in a room in our basement here in Toronto, about 18 feet square, it's filled with a model railway, and as I was saying...
Unbelievable.
And Joe was just there. As I was saying just the other night, I was at an event yesterday, that if you were to tell someone that in your basement you have a huge porn collection, they would say, okay, I get that, but the train thing is kind of strange. So, but I thought, how come in horror fiction, when toys are, infused with evil, they're dolls, or they're mechanical monkeys, or they're a rocking horse, or something like that. And I thought, I wonder if there's a way to make toy trains scary and evil. And that was kind of the genesis, the beginning of thinking about Whistle, but then Whistle also needed to be more than just that. And it becomes a story about a children's illustrator and author named Annie Blunt, who has had a kind of double tragedy. She's lost her husband in a hit-run accident, and one of her children's illustrated books inadvertently led to a horrific tragedy, and she and her young son need to get away from the city and go away and try to get their life back together. And they rent a small house out in the country where her son finds in a shed behind the house in a box full of old toy train stuff. And he starts setting it up, and not long after, strange things start happening. His mom starts hearing train whistles in the middle of the night when there are no railway lines nearby. And she starts seeing things that she could draw that are far more evil than what were in her original books. And all of this ties into something that happened more than 20 years ago, not too far away. But in the sort of broadest sense, that's kind of what Whistle is about. And when I first had the idea for it, I thought, can you do a book about evil trains, toy trains, and not make it silly? And judging from the reviews and what people have had to say, I think I pulled it off. That's the hope, anyway.
I think you did. I want to get into the plot of King Sorrow, but I want to say first, though, that you've recognized, I think, the what's at the heart of all great horror fiction, which is finding something people love and is comforting and then ruining it forever. So they never feel safe around it again.
Right. Our work here is done. That's right.
I'm sort of kidding, but I'm sort of not. Think about how good those first Christmas carols hit. When winter rolls around and you see the first snowfall and then you hear the first Christmas carol on the radio or something, it just makes you feel so good. But if you were out for a walk in the woods on a hot day in July and you were lost and the bugs are bothering you and then you found an old dilapidated house with just no glass in the windows all smashed out, the door hanging ajar, and you heard watery off-key Christmas music coming in from inside, you'd run for fucking cover as fast as you could, and it all comes back to this beautiful line of Lon Chaney's where he said, "There's nothing funny about a clown at midnight." I think about that a lot. you know, as far as King Sorrow was my first novel in almost 10 years. I was doing some other stuff for a while. But King Sorrow is about 6 friends who meet in 1989 in a small liberal arts institution on the coast of Maine. And one of them, a bookish kid named Arthur Oakes, is the senior volunteer librarian at his school's library. And Arthur falls under the power of a couple local scumbags who begin to blackmail him into stealing books from the library's treasure room. I'm sure the Toronto Library has their own special collection, every library does, of rare and expensive books. And stealing from that special collection, stealing books, is about the worst crime I can imagine. Arthur and his friends bonded over their shared love of the occult. What they really like to do on weekends is, you know, drink a little bit, smoke a little weed, and pull out the Ouija board and see if they can summon a spirit. And one weekend they all get bombed and try to summon something to help Arthur. And they wind up bringing a dragon through into our reality, King Sorrow, who's over 3,000 years old, and 700 tons of fun. And King Sorrow solves their immediate problem, but leaves them with a much bigger one, which is that he expects a sacrifice every Easter for the rest of their lives, or he'll take one of them. And so they spend the next 25 years wrestling with this horrifying moral quagmire they've managed to put themselves into. And there's a lot of adventure packed into it. There is, you know, an air disaster story set at 30,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean with a terrorist on board the plane and a dragon fighting F-16s outside the plane. There's an Indiana Jones style plunge into a troll's trap-filled cave. There's a desperate attempt to rescue survivors from a collapsed building. There's a drunken brawl on roller skates. Now, Tolstoy packed a lot into his books. But did he ever give you a drunken assault on roller skates? No, he did not. And what do I say to that? Amateur.
You know, your book is like, imagine the best, most delicious cupcake in the world, and then they make you eat 40 of them. Because your book has so many spectacular scenes in it, just like keep coming at you. You know, it's just.
That's very kind. I did think of it a little bit. I have sometimes said to people that one of the inspirations for it was the TV show Friends, that it's like a bonus season of Friends, only reimagined as horror instead of comedy, you know, the one about the dragon. But in some ways, it's also like the world's most fucked up remake of Pete's Dragon. Spoiling the thing. See how it's all about taking that thing you loved and spoiling it forever?
One thing that both the books have is, in addition to like all this craziness, there's a real balance of grounded characters to care about. In the case of King Sorrow, there's these like really beautiful friendships that go various ways from these college kids, and at the core of Whistle, there's like real familial love and grief. I'm curious how you get the balance right when you're writing something that's like wildly speculative but with real people in it.
I was sort of thinking about that the other day. I think that, you know, you can think of any number of genres or shows, whether it's from Star Trek to Game of Thrones to just about anything. And all of these things are really, if you think very long about it, are unbelievable and couldn't happen and are just completely unrealistic. But if your characters are real, and if you find something in them that you identify with or that you care about, all that other stuff doesn't matter, because now it becomes a really human story. And yes, the background and the where it's happening, it can be maybe fantastical, but if it's the characters that I think that ground it, that can make anything that seems It's too fantastical, becomes believable that way.
Yeah. And Joe, I've also heard, in addition to that question, that you kind of, and you can really see it in this book, you overwrite dialogue initially in early drafts to sort of find those characters and find their real relationships.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, you know, King Sorrow is a long book, but I cut 200 pages out of it, you know, but also, like, I love to read Elmore Leonard's crime novels. And the thing about Elmore's crime novels is the dialogue, right? The dialogue is like listening to hot house jazz. It's that rat-a-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat. And I love that. I love great banter. And, you know, John Steinbeck said, I want to know what a character looks like from the way they talk. And I've always loved that. And I've always thought, you know, you describe your characters best by just letting them talk. You know, just getting to know them by the way they express themselves and where their interests are, and, you know, and so when I'm writing the first draft, I write lots of material that's just for me. I'll get my characters talking about something and I'll have them riff for pages, but ultimately that's not the reader. A little goes a long way. You know, the reader doesn't need all that, and you know, they want to have a laugh and feel like, oh, I know who that person is. But then you got to keep it zipping. You know, you got to keep the pedal down.
I find that you know, when you're introducing a character and they come in at page 5, and so authors spend a lot of time describing what the character looks like. Do you remember that by page 80? I don't. But it's the dialogue. I think it's that right. It's the dialogue and how they interact with other people are what identify them and what makes them memorable.
I mean, Linwood and I were at lunch today, and we were talking about Elmore Leonard, and Linwood said, "Oh, there was this one great part when Raylan is one of Elmore's lead characters. Raylan is going into this union meeting, and this guy outside starts to say, and before Linwood could finish the line, he says, 'I'll see you after this is over.' And Raylan says back to him, 'If I don't get out here right away, you practice falling down until I do.'" I love that. You remember a good line, but yeah, you can't remember what any of the characters are wearing after like 6 pages.
I'm also wondering, I mean, you've written a lot of novels, and this is your first horror. I've read that you sort of come up with the situation first. How did this happen? And this applies to your thrillers. And then you sort of come up with the solutions. How did we end up here? Where do we go? With the infinite sort of options that the horror genre gives you, did you find that complicated? There's too many answers?
No. Well, I found Whistle was not only the most fun book I've written in the last 10 years, in many ways it was the easiest. And it was because, you know what, my regular thrillers are set very much in the real world, and they're all bound by the rules of the real world, and they need to be believable. But in Whistle, I think I'll just have her look at a toy boxcar, and suddenly millions of spiders will come out of it.
Yeah.
And you think, well, if I were writing one of my other books, you can't do that because that doesn't happen. But in this, I thought, I can get away with that because it's a different kind of book. I think there are still rules that apply that you have to, within that world, you have to sort of operate in a way that sort of makes sense. But you have all this freedom. You can have train whistles going in the middle of the night when there are no trains. You can have someone running out onto an abandoned railway track and then look and see the lights of an oncoming train, and then it's gone. You can get away with that. And so it was kind of liberating. You know, I could do stuff that I wasn't allowed to do in my regular books. Yeah. And so in that way, I thought it was just really a blast. Really, so much fun.
This is what I'm talking about. This is why horror's so great.
Yeah.
Because you write this stuff like a lot of times where you have to think up explanations for things, you know, like why doesn't the heroine is in the house and she's being besieged by these guys outside the house. Why doesn't she just pick up her cell phone and call the police? You know, like, you've got to solve that problem. But in a supernatural story where she's being besieged by like some supernatural horror, she picks up the phone and she dials 911, and then the voice on the other end of the line says, "You will die." You know, and it's like, because like the supernatural is like coming through her phone. It's just a lot easier, man. I've been trying to tell you this.
But then you go and make things much harder for yourself by having college kids grow up for a couple of decades in a way that's realistic and consistent to their characters.
Yeah. The thing about the leads of King Sorrow is I felt when I set out to write the book, one of the things I wanted to do is, it's the first time I've ever sort of looked back at what my generation did to the world, most of which I don't think is all that great, to be honest. And but I wanted to track these 6 friends through the years, which involved a lot of change, a lot of political change, a lot of technological change, a lot of cultural change, and I wanted that all playing out in the background while they're locked into this mortal struggle with King Sorrow. And I felt that it was important to provide a broad cross-section of American life. So one of the things I did do is I tried to place every single one of my leads at a different point on the political spectrum. So you have one character who's very far right and one character who's very far left, and hilariously, they're brother and sister. And then you have one character who's center left and one character who's center right. A kind of Hillary Clinton Democrat and a kind of George Bush Republican. And then there's another dude who's like a libertarian tech bro. And then finally, one of the friends is sort of almost indifferent to politics, thinks no matter who you vote for, you always get the government. And her interests are almost entirely, what can I do locally? What can I do in my backyard, because whatever's going to happen down in Washington, D.C., I don't have any pull there. And I obviously have my bias. I have my political position. I have my philosophy and approach to doing things, but I did think it was important to craft each character in a way where if you were coming from where they were politically, you'd say, yeah, this is fair, and I tried to find what was good in each character, even if they have views that I actively dislike. I tried to find what was good in each character, and if I couldn't find what was good in each character, I at least tried to find what was strong in each character. And and I thought even some of the characters who do some things that I personally find abhorrent or hold views that that fill me with dismay, I thought all of them were good company. I couldn't have spent 3 years writing about them if I didn't enjoy being with them.
The characters are so often they're defined by what they do, and Annie in your book, she's an illustrator of children's books, and she finds herself quite blocked because she's grieving. I also, in my little bit of research, I discovered that your father was also an illustrator, and Annie's illustrating kind of gives her a sort of psychic vision. I was wondering, did your father also have a psychic vision because he could draw?
No, he drew cars. Back in the 50s and the 60s, if you were to look through the pages of Life or Look magazine or Saturday Evening Post, or look at brochures from a car dealership, all of the cars were illustrations. They didn't use photography much, and my dad drew those cars. So, and Joe was just at the house, and I have a hallway in the kind of gallery of my dad's artwork in a basement hallway of all these gorgeous cars from the 50s that he illustrated. And I suppose that may be one of the reasons I made Annie an illustrator, but I think I was kind of modeling Annie after Ian Falconer, who did the Olivia books. And my wife in particular, but we love the Olivia books. They're so charming and quirky and funny. And I pictured Annie being that kind of a person who did those kind of books. And it's funny, when I first had the idea of this sort of evil infused trains, I knew I needed another story. It couldn't just be about that, and it needed a really strong human interest story. And I don't know, and we were talking about this last night, there's a lot of times I think, when did I decide to make it Annie, and had decided to make her an illustrator? And that kind of where elephants go to die are things I don't know. They're just kind of happened. But it was funny, we were talking earlier that when I'm starting any novel, any of my other novels, I always need what I consider to be like a great hook or a great way into the book. And that's what I start with. And 19 years ago, when I did the book, was my most successful book, still was a book called No Time for Goodbye that was a massive hit, sold millions. And I'd had this idea, which was about a girl who wakes up one morning and her whole entire family's gone. And the whole mystery is what happened to them over the 25 years later, and she's never known what happened. And because I was doing a standard kind of a thriller, I realize now I could have just had the family go into another dimension. Sure. Why did I have? But back then I had to think, I have to find a reason, a really good reason, why all of these things happened. And it starts to be, it's like you're assembling on paper a Swiss watch or a jigsaw puzzle. All of these pieces have to fit. And when you're reading a thriller where you see that the writer has to solve the mystery, takes that proverbial square peg and jams it into the round hole to make it work, you see that, you get it, you think they didn't pull it off. They forced an ending on you that really isn't, and I hate this, it sounds like a cliche, but it isn't organic, it doesn't really work.
One crime writer that I really love, Anthony Horowitz, said that he actually thinks it's immoral to write a mystery when you don't know who done it before you started. And I definitely think,
I agree.
I think when it comes to a fair play mystery or sort of straightforward crime, you have to know who committed the crime and what the nature of the crime was before you start writing, or you're piloting for you're flying into disaster.
And I think the reason you need to know that is that when you as the writer are jumping from head to head writing dialogue for all these people, when you jump into the head of one of this character, you have to know that they're lying.
Right.
You have to know that what you're writing when you jump into the head of that character is a lie. And that's why I think he's right. I think you need, I think you need to know. I mean, there's this whole, a lot of time crime writers are asked whether they're what they call plotters or pantsers. Do you plot the whole thing out, or do you go by the seat of your pants? And I fall somewhere in the middle. Before I start, I want to know what set of circumstances triggered everything that happens in that book.
I did a panel in Brighton about a week ago with a fantasy writer named Ryan Cahill, and I was talking about I had heard from George R. R. Martin that there are two kinds of writers: architects and gardeners. And I thought, yeah, I'm a gardener, I get it. And Ryan Cahill was saying, the people who boast about not working from outline are actually the worst. Because they are the worst plotters. They are the biggest plotters of all, because they write a whole draft to plot the thing out. That their outline is actually a whole draft, as opposed to connecting the dots in a more skeletal outline beforehand. And I was actually like, that's kind of true, because I definitely look at the first draft of a book as being like a sketch for what will later be a painting. But at first I'm just trying to capture an energy and sort of get a sense of, well, where are objects in the frame and so on.
Well, like I was saying last night, I wouldn't start building a house without blueprints and a solid foundation. I know roughly what it's going to look like, but I don't need to know what color the walls will be painted. I don't need to know what kind of furniture it will have. I can figure that out later. But the basic structure before you get started, I think you need to know.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true even in a supernatural story.
I always allow myself one dumb question, and Linwood,
There are no dumb questions.
You robbed me of half of it, and it was the great answer.
Let's not rush to conclusions.
It was going to be why trains and why dragons. So we already know why trains, but why dragons?
That's the stupidest question I've ever heard.
I know, right?
I followed through on my promise.
I mean, I wish I had a really good answer to that. I have a couple, canned answers, but none of them really, I don't really know how King Sorrow came into my life or why that wound up being the next book. I know that I do have this idea that there's a trap door in every novel that leads to the next novel. In the last book, The Fireman, was about this pathogen that's spreading all over the world called dragon scale. And you get it on you, and it's actually very beautiful looking. It looks like a swirly black tattoo. But if you can't control your stress levels, you begin to heat up and smoke. And if you can't clamp down on your fear and anger, you die of spontaneous combustion. And so people are burning to death all over the world, and neighborhoods are going up in flames. And some people, even before they die, breathe fire like dragons. And at some point, working on The Fireman, I thought, I wonder if the next book's going to be about a dragon, But in some ways, the roots of King Sorrow go all the way back to being 10 years old and read The Hobbit and just thinking it was the greatest, and thinking Smaug was like maybe the best fictional character ever. I still kind of think, it's like Sherlock Holmes is pretty great, Dracula's pretty cool, but I still think Smaug has the inside edge as like my personal fave.
I was thinking about what you said about how every book has a trapdoor to the next one. And it made me think of something that had been said about one of my literary heroes, Ross MacDonald, which was all of those Lou Archer novels, all of it, it's called It's All One Case. It's as though your entire output, all of your oeuvre, is it all starts to blend together. It all becomes one huge masterpiece or whatever. And that's why they're all linked in that way.
Yeah.
Or maybe not.
Or maybe...
I don't know.
Or maybe it's kind of like all my books have they're all just 1 quarter pounder after another. Jesus, and now I'm getting depressed.
Well, let's talk about kindness then, and how it can go horribly wrong. In King Sorrow, it's a kind act by one of your characters that sets off the whole shooting match.
Right. If King Sorrow is there to tell you anything, it's don't be nice to people. You'll regret it for the rest of your life.
All Arthur Oakes does is lend his hoodie to a woman who needs it, and it ends up, beginning to destroy his life. And I saw a parallel in Whistle, because Annie's editor, who's just trying to help her out, rents his house for her. And that house turns out to be this sort of nest of evil.
Yes, except was he manipulated to rent that house for her?
Isn't it still nice if you're manipulated into it?
Yes.
Yeah. But in both cases, it's almost as though the kindness sort of lets the evil in, lets the horror in.
Yeah, no good deed goes unpunished.
Yeah. But I don't know. I feel like these are both kind of moral horror novels. I did notice that your bad guy's first initial is E and his last name is Nabler, and you have that parallel with Needful Things by Stephen King. So there's sort of an idea that you have to let this evil in, and that can either be by desire or by niceness.
Yeah, and one of the other things, the sort of evil proprietor of this model train shop, who's in a separate sort of storyline in the novel that takes place some 20 years earlier. We talked about how the villains never know they're the villain. And Edwin Nabler, who is infusing these trains with evil and creating all sorts of mayhem and death, he considers that he's basically doing a public service. Because without tragedy, there's really no joy. If everything was always wonderful and always happy, you wouldn't really appreciate it as much if you didn't know that on the flip side of the coin is great sorrow and tragedy. And so he's seeing a world now where there's seat belts in all the cars, the playgrounds are all padded, everything is safety, there's fire extinguishers and smoke detectors everywhere you go. So the world needs a little help for there to be more death and mayhem. And he's happy to step in and provide that service.
Without going too deep into the plot of King Sorrow, Joe, I was really curious about sort of your thoughts on technology, because there seems to be, a general suspicion about whether technological progress is human progress.
Yeah, I'm sort of like, I keep the temperature in my office set to about 1976. I write on a typewriter and I listen to music on vinyl, and I've become this old man sitting on his front porch shaking his cane at the 21st century, But I don't the billionaire tech class has unleashed wave after wave after wave of shitty, reckless, addictive tech products on the whole world. They don't care what they break as long as they get richer. I mean, things we can feel the body politic. In America, our political system, it's like someone injected rabies into it, and now it's foaming at the mouth and everyone's gone crazy. And in some ways, Donald Trump is like the symptom, not like the cause. This is the cause. It's this. It's doing everyone is now, segmented off into the invented reality that exists on their phone, that has only a distant relationship with the real reality that exists off your phone. And everyone is on their phone all day. I'm not putting myself above anyone else, and I'm just as bad, but it's left everyone exhausted and stressed out and paranoid and conspiratorial and convinced that everyone who has views different from them is monstrous, and it's just eating our society apart at the joints. And the people who created these conditions, for God's sake, Mark Zuckerberg went off and bought most of a Hawaiian island, and he's got like a 10-level bunker there, so I mean, he can wait it out when everything collapses. Yeah. We can't. And so, but other than that, I have actually no views about technology at all.
It's like that. It's like that great photo I saw at some point. It's kind of apocryphal. It's that photo taken inside the Louvre. This is before the thievery, but anyway, inside the Louvre, in the room where the Mona Lisa is, and all these people are in the room with the Mona Lisa, and all of them are looking at their phones.
Yeah.